Before we get into the stories, I'm excited to announce I have a new channel called Monster Trail Cams. Here's a quick trailer for my new channel. The link is below. Monster Trail Cams is your ticket to the unseen and supernatural. Sourced from a vast network of mystery hunters worldwide, our channel reveals a collection of strange creatures and supernatural events that will leave you on the edge of your seat. From shadowy figures lurking in dense forests to inexplicable entities prowling under the cloak of night, each chilling clip peels back another layer of the world's untold mysteries. We release new episodes several times a week. Okay, now let's get to the stories. Disclosure. For privacy, the names and year this happened have been changed. This was one of the creepiest, chilling things me and my friends experienced. Yosemite is one of the most beautiful spiritual places, as well as terrifying and creepy. It's like Snow White with razor blades, both beautiful and dangerous. I have never felt or seen anything like this place. In April of 2019, I took a trip out to California to see some friends. I had lived in Los Angeles with this particular friend, let's just call her Katie, just several years ago. And since then, she got married and now lives in Northern California with her husband, Ed. They are avid expert hikers, especially her husband. He's been hiking all his life with his family all over the country and teaches wilderness survival part-time, so I felt like I was in good hands with him. We were in the woods Easter weekend. More on that in a bit. The first few days we were out there, everything went as planned. We even went a bit deeper into the forest than we had planned because he wanted to show me a few things. This made my friend a bit nervous because she knew there was a certain point that no one goes any further. A lot weirder things happen the deeper you go, but he was one of those guys who push the limits of everything. I'm serious when I tell you there is absolutely no one out there, or so we thought. I was able to keep up with them. As you can imagine, they are in incredible shape. They had to stop a few times for me, but we were doing okay. About 4 days in, we were almost done. It was the eve of Easter Sunday, and we had planned on camping out one more night before we made it back to the truck. So, our last night we found a spot and set up camp. They were in a tent, and I was in my own. The first few nights I was a bit creeped out, but by the fourth night I was so exhilarated by this magical place, I had been sleeping peacefully. And between the fresh air and hiking, I was usually out as soon as I laid down. This night we had made a fire and had something to eat. It was getting dark, and off in the distance we heard some drumming. This went on for about an hour. It seemed to get louder, and then it would die down. It stopped for a while, and then it started up again. We could see a light coming up from the forest. Ed said they had a pretty big fire going. Apparently he had a few forest ranger friends, and they had told him there are rituals that take place out there. They picked the middle of nowhere because they can do what they need to do and not be bothered. This was terrifying to me and Katie. We both suggested we head back in the dark and get out of there, but Ed said no, we'll leave as soon as the sky breaks tomorrow morning. We were all quiet at this point, and I brought my sleeping bag in the tent. He told us to just be quiet and try to sleep, but that wasn't happening. Shortly after, the drumming got louder. We heard some kind of loud Latin-sounding chanting coming from a group of people. It sounded like at least 20 people or more, followed by some screaming and yelling. It went silent for what seemed like a few minutes, then like a knife piercing the night. A woman started screaming. You could hear what sounded like gasping and trying to catch her breath. It was a guttural, primal, painful, blood-curdling scream that went on for about 10 minutes. No doubt she was being murdered and sacrificed. We sat there frozen in the tent. With the light of the flashlight in the sleeping bag, I could see the silhouette of Katie's body hunched over, moving up and down with her hand over her mouth, quietly sobbing. I sat there in shock. I could feel my heart beating heavily in my chest, and my legs started shaking with the amount of adrenaline running through my body. The sounds that woman was making during the last horrifying moments of her life will haunt me forever. I wanted out of there, but there's no way we could go 18 miles in the dark back to the truck. Then suddenly her screams stopped. The forest was deathly quiet. It's like every living thing took notice and stopped. Then a male voice started chanting again, followed by more drumming. This went on for what seemed like a few more hours until somehow I managed to fall asleep. I was woken by Katie shaking me, telling me to hurry up, we're going. I was somewhat relieved to see a bit of light coming into the tent, but barely. Ed said he heard something by the tent the rest of the night, and any one of those people could more than likely still out there. We packed up, and it had to be the longest 18 miles. We were supposed to enjoy this hike back with the beautiful scenery, but I felt like we were running for our lives. We barely said a word, and we went as fast as we could, not making a sound. Me and Katie were constantly looking back to make sure we were alone, and nothing was following us. I was never so happy to see Ed's truck and some civilization. Not that anyone could do anything about it, but this was reported, and he later contacted a friend who said they have a lot of these reports around the solstices, full moons, and specifically on Easter. There is a dark connection to that holiday, and that's specifically when they use adults for human sacrifice. Katie hasn't been hiking since, but Ed still goes with friends now and then. She still brings up that woman and wonders who she was and if she had family. I took a hike out in the Glen Canyon area of Utah. We weren't in Glen Canyon itself, but more on the outskirts. We'd driven a few states west with a group of 4 other friends in a shared caravan and had been at it for about a week and a half before we started getting sick of each other. Jared and I decided to go on a solo hike by ourselves to get a little space from the others and wind down. We left our 4 friends back at the RV park, and after seeing the crowds at Glen Canyon, this was in late June, decided to find a less popular trail. We always hike prepared, so I wasn't too worried about going off the main trails. We bring extra food, matches, water, and both of us have compasses too. I even had a paper map of the area. We found a trail that looked more like a scratched-up area over some rocks and dug in. It was a tough start to the hike, and the elevation ratcheted up quickly until we were up probably almost 1,000 feet in less than half an hour. This area of Utah is stereotypically rocky. Think like those beige rock formations you see on postcards, and can be really dangerous. There are a lot of little canyons, crevices, and grooves to shimmy up. At one point I was pretty sure we weren't on the trail anymore, and mentioned this to Jared. We took a break to eat a few granola bars and check the map. After a few minutes, we figured out where we were, and I was right. We definitely weren't on a trail. However, the surrounding area looked passable, so we decided to continue exploring until the going got a little more tough. The elevation rose a bit higher in the next half hour, and when I checked my cell, I didn't have any reception. But the views were beautiful, so I just passed some time by taking a lot of photos. Jared called me over to an area that wasn't exactly flat, but kind of plateaued. We'd been looking for our next way up when he pointed at a section of rock wall. It was rough, but there were numbers carved into the rock. At first, I thought we'd found some kind of ancient civilization carvings. They aren't uncommon out in this area, but I realized they were just regular Arabic numerals like 1, 2, 3. But a whole string of numbers that, when we looked closer, appeared to have been stamped in the stone. I looked at Jared, but he didn't know what could have done that, especially out in the middle of nowhere like this. I snapped a photo of the string of numbers, and after getting over an uneasy feeling, we kept going a little further. We'd found a very shallow gully that went up and had to brace our feet almost sideways to climb it. This ended in a sort of canyon area. Around the rim of and at the base of the canyon was stagnant water. It had rained a few days ago, so this wasn't surprising. I told Jared I wanted a break because, to be honest, I was kind of weirded out about the numbers. I sat down to drink some water while he wandered around the rim for a little, and within a few minutes, he was calling to me. Honestly, I didn't want to go in case he found something more disturbing, but I didn't want to be alone either, especially now that I felt off. So I got up and carefully made my way over to him. He'd found a wide crevice in the rim that dropped down a few feet and was down inside there. He had to duck down to fit, but when he scooted to the side, I could see a metal door pressed into the rock. It looked unreal and industrial with wide bolts and trim. There wasn't a handle that I could see anywhere, so I'm not sure you could even call it a door. I told Jared to get out of there, but he banged around on the metal for a bit before finally listening. I probably sounded really distraught. We were in such a remote area, and after the strange numbers punched into the rocks, I had no idea what we were dealing with here. Humans must have made both the numbers and the door, but why? What was behind the door? With it being so remote, it made it seem like whatever it was dangerous or secret. As soon as Jared climbed back up, I told him I wanted to leave now. He tried to cajole me into hanging out and poking around a bit more, but I could tell he thought this was a weird find too. We hiked back out much faster than we'd come in, and that night at the RV, Jared told our friends what we'd found. If it was up to me, I don't think I ever would have mentioned it. At first, they laughed, but I think the look on my face convinced them we weren't kidding. There were a few theories flying around, including that it was some kind of government hideout. I have no idea what they would do at such a remote location, especially since it was tough to get there, but I guess it would be a good place to hide things if that's what's happening there. Since the door was essentially smooth with no visible lock or door handle, I'm not sure how anyone would even get in, or what those carved numbers in the rock were for. I'd be interested to hear if anyone else has come across the numbers and door, but I don't suggest anyone go looking for it. It was about 9 or 10 years ago that this happened, and I'm still affected by it. I've heard a lot of wild camping stories from people I know, but nothing like this. I've always been an avid backpacker, and I like to get into some pretty remote places. I mostly go alone since my friends aren't as into it as I am. Yeah, I know that's not the best idea. And now I really know. I had wanted to explore New Mexico, so I made plans to hike one spring into the Bandelier Wilderness. The wilderness covers an expanse of over 23,000 acres, all within New Mexico, and I was planning to spend the better part of a week checking out as much of it as I could. I spent the first night sleeping under a gorgeous starry sky and listening to the crickets. It felt great to be out there. And then by the second day, I was over 20 miles into the wilderness. Near the end of that second day, I came across a fresh mule deer kill in the canyon. I had seen mountain lion kills before, and this looked like that's what it was. Usually a fresh kill means the hunter is close, which also meant potential trouble since hunting was prohibited, making this poaching. So I was on heightened alert and on the lookout for any signs. However, once I climbed out of the canyon, my mind didn't dwell on it, and I didn't give it too much thought after that. I was hiking along the rim of the canyon, and I found a nice sheltered sandstone ledge with a shallow cave area on one side. The cliff of the canyon was about 15 feet away, and I had a clear view of everything to the south and west, with the canyon directly north of me. It seemed like a perfect place to spend the night. I was only a few hundred yards up from where I had noticed the kill before. I got my tent set up and anchored down. I ate my dinner and was just leaning back against the sandstone and staring at the sky. It had just gotten dark, and I was about to doze off when I heard this blood-curdling howl. I jumped to my feet and soon heard it again. I grabbed for my flashlight, trying not to get stabbed by the cactus or fall off the cliff. I wanted to assess the situation, but once I got the flashlight on, it didn't help me find the source of the howl. It sounded close and angry, which got me to thinking that the animal would scent me. I hadn't showered in a few days and was pretty ripe. The howl came again, and it was unearthly and unbelievably loud. I had heard some wild noises in the mountains before, but not like that. It sounded like a whooping noise, and it seemed to be coming from the east, which was the only direction I didn't have a view toward. I thought about packing up and leaving, but then I realized I'd be a fool to try to outrun a mountain lion in the dark. I decided my only choice at that point was to wait and see what happened. I had a few big rocks collected and my mace in my hand. I also had my hiking poles, which would be a better defense than nothing. I heard another howl that sounded farther away, but then I didn't hear any more. By now, the moon was rising and it was about 3/4 full and really bright, so I had some night vision at least. I was crouched there on my sandstone cliff, listening like crazy, But after a long time of listening and nothing further happening, I decided to get into my tent and try to sleep. I was exhausted, and so actually fell asleep pretty quick. I don't know how much time had gone by, but I think it was at least a few hours later when I was woken up by these rustling noises outside my tent, and a terrible smell that hadn't been there before. The moon was shining brightly at that point. I peeked out of the tent window, and I could see something big and shadowy moving around. It didn't seem at all like a mountain lion. The shadow was huge and bulky and really tall. It was moving all around my tent and shuffling in a way that made it seem really heavy. And then I watched it as it put its paw on my tent. I could even clearly see the outline against the nylon. I say paw, but I almost want to say hand. Like a huge ape-like hand, like at least twice the size of a full-grown man's hand. It was terrifying. The hand was moving back and forth, rubbing the tent, almost in a way that seemed that it had probably never felt something like that before. All I could do was lay there. I mean, what else could I do? There was nowhere to go except right into the thing. I didn't know if it would be better to be silent or if I should make some threatening noises. Ultimately, I decided to just lay low and stay silent so as not to rile it up. I lay there imagining how long it was going to take someone to find my mauled body out there in the back country. It would probably be weeks and weeks, and I would be a skeleton by then. That thing must have spent at least 10 minutes shuffling around and feeling my tent. The smell of it was nearly overpowering. I could hardly stand it, and twice had to hold back gagging. And then I heard what sounded like it was shuffling away. I didn't sleep, and I didn't get up to look. I waited all night. It didn't come back. I got myself together at sunrise and packed up as quietly as I could. I was really wishing and hoping that the thing was nocturnal and would be gone by daybreak. I started hiking out, but as far in as I was, I didn't have any choice but to spend another night out there. Luckily, despite me barely sleeping, nothing else happened. When I got back to my truck the next day, I was just a wreck from not sleeping for 2 nights and hiking all that way. I got home safely, but swore to myself that I would never go out again without a weapon. I don't share this story too often, but here you go. I was born and raised in Alaska. The older I get, the more I realize how great it was to have the childhood I did. Growing up in a small town off the road system was amazing. Our parents made sure we took advantage of all the opportunities that were available. We got used to being outside all the time as kids. We would camp, hunt, and fish when we were really young. By the time I was an older teenager, I was just about fully independent. My parents trusted me to be out and about alone quite often. I loved to get out in the wilderness and explore whenever I could. In the town I lived in, as long as it was a clear night, it was very normal to see all sorts of strange lights move across the sky. The winter is long up there, and I spent a lot of time under the stars. It was incredibly beautiful for anyone who didn't mind the cold too much. Sometimes I would drive a snowmobile a few miles out of town and just lay down on the snow looking up at the sky. The northern lights were also a pretty common sight. It wasn't something that happened every day, but often enough that people up there were pretty used to it. Now that I live in the lower states, I realize how many people would just love to see them. But up there, they started seeming ordinary after a while. On this one night, I had a lot on my mind and couldn't get to sleep. I decided to go out on one of my midnight drives. I didn't tell my parents, and they were probably asleep anyway. But I knew they wouldn't mind. I took the snowmobile and drove a few miles over the hills. I wanted to find a spot without any light pollution from the town. I shut off the engine and settled into a good spot to look up and have some good thinking time. I was in a relationship that was kind of driving me crazy, and I was trying to decide what to do about it. At first, it was just the usual scene. I watched a few satellites passing over here and there. I picked out the constellations that I knew. But after a while I started noticing a clicking noise. At first I thought it was the sound of the snowmobile cooling down, like the engine expanding and contracting in the cold. But then I realized the sound definitely wasn't coming from that direction. I sat up and looked around thinking maybe there was some animal nearby. I was prepared to get out of there fast in that case. I didn't want to be dealing with a wild animal in the middle of the night. But I thought the clicking sounded way too regular for it to be coming from an animal. Also, it was pretty mechanical sounding. The more I listened, the more I realized that the sound seemed to be coming from above and in front of me. I was staring upward and just seeing what I usually saw: stars, some northern light action, a satellite crossing the sky, all normal things. I laid back down trying to get to a peaceful state of mind. After a while I was getting too cold and was about ready to head home. But I noticed something looked odd in the aurora borealis. There were 3 super bright points of light. At first I thought they were stars, but they were too perfectly placed. And they were definitely getting brighter. I kept staring and watched them continue to get brighter and brighter. At this point, I swore the clicking noise was getting louder and louder. Then it just stopped. The lights were gone and the clicking wasn't there, and everything actually sounded extra quiet. I was getting pretty stiff and cold, and maybe slightly spooked. I got up to leave, and then all of a sudden, this bright 3-orbed object was hovering above me, much closer now than those 3 lights had been. The clicking was loud now. It was triangle-shaped with 1 light orb on top and 2 underneath, all simultaneously moving together. I bet 10 to 20 seconds passed, but it felt like an hour. Then all of a sudden it went from hovering to hitting warp speed in the blink of an eye, and it shot off to the horizon and disappeared. I jumped on the snowmobile, and don't you know it was taking longer than usual to start up. I was starting to worry, but then it was running, and I headed to my house. My mind was full of speculation, wondering if what I saw was some kind of weird behavior of the northern lights that I'd never heard about. I pulled up to my house thinking I had to get inside and get to bed without waking anyone up. But then I saw the windows were all lit up, which was really strange. I'm now wondering why my parents would be up at like 2 in the morning. I had left around midnight and was gone for maybe 2 hours. I went into the house and my mom was awake and standing in the kitchen making coffee. I looked at the kitchen clock and it said 6 in the morning. I just stared at the clock, not understanding. Then I realized I must have been out there staring at those clicking lights for like 6 hours. There was no way, but I sure couldn't argue with the time. I ended up telling my mom and dad the whole story. They were just blown away by it all. But they're the kind of parents who know me well and know that I wouldn't make stuff like that up. I never even ended up going to bed at all that day. That was one of the most amazing things that's ever happened to me.